Well, look, it's Easter week. This, for me, I mean, I love the Christmas season, but Easter week, I mean, it's important, obviously, the birth of Christ and all that, but the birth of Christ is outside of those early chapters in the Gospels is not mentioned hardly at all. It is in Revelation where we have this apocalyptic version of the birth of Christ with the dragon and so on, and so it's important. But man, the cross and the resurrection, that's it. That's the core of the whole thing. And sometimes I'm asked about prayer because I do a lot of praying. John, do you really believe in prayer? And my answer is, well, yeah. I mean, I would not pray if I didn't believe that prayer accomplished what I understand it to accomplish. If I didn't believe that praying brought me into a relationship with God, that I was thinking and doing along with God the things that God is thinking and doing. So yes, I believe in prayer. The sign is that I pray. And on occasions, I'm also asked, do you really believe that in this supernatural event that Jesus rose from the dead? And well, yes, there's no way I would be a Christian. There's no way I would be a follower of Jesus if I didn't believe uh, in the event of the cross, and on the third day after that, Jesus was raised from the dead. I wouldn't believe that at all. The Apostle Paul says the same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins. And those who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. And then in 1 Corinthians 15:32, Paul says, if all I did in Ephesus, I fought wild beasts in Ephesus, and I only had human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And for me, those would be the alternatives. So yes, I believe that Christ was raised from the dead. And I wouldn't be a Christian if I didn't believe that. And I was one of those, and I'm sure there are others who, right from the beginning of my Christian life, I began to study this. So in 1970, when I got rescued, when I got sozoed, I began to study evidence for the resurrection. And I was spurred on by some of the campus pastors at the university I was studying at. One of them was named John Peterson, who was really a great scholar, especially in defending the faith. And the other was William Lane Craig, who has turned out to be one of the greatest Christian philosophers in the world. And Bill Craig was studying evidence for the resurrection way back in 1970, and I and some others were studying along with him. And I did doctoral work in the historical resurrection. And usually every year I read another book on the resurrection. So I just finished reading this book by N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God. And it's about 750 pages, about 800 pages. Oh man, I tell you, it's so thorough. Talks about the surrounding culture and ideas of death and resurrection in Greek and Roman religions, and in ancient Semitic cultures, of what they all believe, putting the whole resurrection story in context. Wow, what a read that book is. And right now, for your Kindle, this book you can get on your Kindle for $2.99, 800 pages of N.T. Wright on the resurrection, one of the best books on it ever. So why do I believe that Christ was raised from the dead? Um, well, a few preliminaries. First, in order to study a putative or an intended historical event, you have to try to put aside your worldview. Look, everyone has bias. I don't think there's such a thing as a pure neutral position to study anything, but you can become aware of your bias and your worldview. So let's say if a historian has a worldview that's naturalism or physicalism, which means a naturalistic worldview does not allow for anything supernatural, well, then of course you're not going to believe that Christ was raised from the dead. A priori, that is, before you even approach the text, you'll have this idea it couldn't happen because dead people don't rise. But, you know, I think, like with Craig Keener and others, that to be a real historian, we have to try to put away these biases, and we have to go where the evidence leads, and not conclude before we even start to study the event that, oh, it couldn't have happened because dead people don't rise. A second preliminary. The first preliminary is you watch your worldview. And if you tend towards philosophical naturalism or physicalism, the idea that physical reality is the only thing that is, and science is the only thing that gives us answers, which I think is to be rejected on a number of fronts, you're not gonna be able to grasp these texts. Second, about the Bible. Do I believe the Bible is from God? Yes, I do. I did a whole Facebook presentation on this. I don't know, a few months ago, why I believe the Bible is from God. And again, and that's on Facebook, and if it's on Facebook, it's got to be true, although it might be investigated. But the Bible, in addition to those of us who believe it's from God, just historically, it's ancient texts. The New Testament is is a collection of ancient texts written in the 1st century. And even if we didn't think that the Bible was from God, these texts are enormously valuable in getting at events and the culture of the time. So my argument for the resurrection of Christ is based on using the Bible as an ancient text. Yes, I believe it is from God, but I don't need that to make a case that Christ was raised from the dead. And by the way, everyone that makes this kind of argument, like Gary Habermas, like William Lane Craig, like N.T. Wright, and so on, makes the case for the resurrection based on the Bible as being ancient texts. And we study these texts as historians. So don't rule out the supernatural a priori, that is, prior to approaching the text. Second, we're going to view the Bible as ancient texts written in the 1st century, valuable in their own right. And third, we're going to use a form of reasoning called abductive reasoning, or inference to the best explanation. And inference to the best explanation works like this. Let's say that you have two friends and their names are Tim and Harry, and you know that Tim and Harry recently had a terrible fight that ended their friendship. But then someone tells you that they saw Tim and Harry jogging together today and talking together afterwards. Now, what's the best explanation for that event, Tim and Harry talking together? Well, a good explanation would be they must have made it right in their relationship. They must have got their acts together. They made up. And you would conclude that probably they are friends again. That would be a very good explanation for the event of Tim and Harry jogging together after they had this fight. Let me give one more example. Let's say you walked into a room with a tile floor, and on the floor you saw fresh ink spilled, and the ink formed a beautiful portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And then you were given two competing explanations. One person says, well, I think some art student was walking into the room, tripped, spilled the ink, and it just happened to form the portrait of Abraham Lincoln. Now, could that happen? Well, yeah, it could, but it's very unlikely. A better explanation for that event of the Abraham Lincoln ink portrait on the floor would be that some artist came in there with ink and drew a portrait of Lincoln on the floor. By inference to the best explanation, we can get at the causes of certain events. What caused the portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the floor? The best explanation, or the most likely one, is that an artist did it, not that the ink was just randomly spilled. So keeping that in mind, inference to the best explanation. I'm going to show you why I believe we can use inference to the best explanation, abductive reasoning, historical reasoning, which, by the way, is probabilistic. In history, there is no absolute certainty. This is not math. All historical arguments are probabilistic. That is, some are more probable than others. But using that form of reasoning, now I'm going to respond to the question, why do I believe that Jesus was raised physically from the dead? And I'm going to begin with an event. Let me just remind you now, an event. Like what? Like Tim and Harry having an argument, but then someone sees them jogging together and talking together. And let's add, as they're talking, they were smiling. What's the best explanation for that event? Or another event, the ink on the floor forming a beautiful portrait of Abraham Lincoln. Given that state of affairs or that event, what's the best explanation? Now, there is an event, there is a state of affairs that are historically factual, but demands an explanation. And the historical fact is this: in the first century in Jerusalem, there was a small band of people, Jesus' former disciples, and maybe some others, who were telling people in Jerusalem that Jesus was raised from the dead. And this word was spreading. And as we know, they eventually met in an upper room. And then in the book of Acts, they went on to the streets and shared this. And many people were coming to believe in Jesus. That's the beginning of the church. So that the church, whatever it is today, it had a beginning. And it began in the first century, probably about 33 AD, where a group of people were insisting that Jesus was raised from the dead. They were insisting that the tomb was empty, and they were insisting that Jesus, in a resurrected form, had appeared to many. And they were spreading this word, and they were risking their lives. They were willing to suffer and die for the message that the tomb was empty, Jesus has appeared to us, and he's alive. Okay, that event. Okay, that's a factual event. I mean, the church began like that. And virtually no scholar disputes that happened. But what's the explanation for that event? Using abductive reasoning or inference to the best explanation, what's the best explanation for that event happening? But first, about the event. How do we know that happened? Well, we have the book of Acts as a historical document. But outside of the biblical text, we have a number of writers, like Clement of Rome, born in 35 AD and died in 99 AD. And Clement wrote down that these disciples of Jesus in Jerusalem and beyond were spreading the word that Jesus is alive, and we're suffering for that and being martyred for that. Then a little later, a few years later than Clement of Rome, was Polycarp, born in 69 AD, died in 155 AD, and Polycarp wrote of these Christians suffering and even dying because they believed in this message. Then Ignatius in 110 AD wrote about it. Tertullian wrote about it. Origen in the 2nd century wrote about it. Eusebius in the 3rd century wrote about it. So we have these sources and more that are both biblical and non-biblical, that affirm the idea that these disciples were willing to suffer and die for their belief that Jesus was raised from the dead. That event demands an explanation. Does this make sense? That's a historical event. The church, that was the beginning of the church. What best explains these people who call themselves disciples of Christ, willing to give their lives for the sake of a message like that? Now, it doesn't mean that they were right about the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, they were, but it does mean historically, what is certain historically is that those disciples believed it was true. Whether you would agree that the event happened or not, that he rose from the dead and the tomb was empty, they believed it was true. They believed it so much that they suffered and died for it. And Gary Habermas, one of our great scholars on the resurrection, says virtually no critical scholar questions the idea that these disciples, they had strong convictions that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and that Jesus was causing this radical transformation in them, and they would even give their lives for it. And then Habermas says, you've got to have an explanation for that belief. So the historical question is, what best explains the emergence of this belief and practice in these people? And the answer given by N.T. Wright, for example, in his massive book on the resurrection, the answer to that is that the widespread belief and practice of the early Christians is only explainable if we assume that they all believed that Jesus was bodily resurrected, bodily raised, and the reason they believed that Jesus was bodily raised is because the tomb Jesus was buried in was empty. And over a short period of time thereafter, Jesus appeared to them and to many others. If we were to ask, if we could go back in a time machine and ask those early Christians, why do you give your lives for the sake of this message? They would say, how do you know? And they would say, because that tomb was empty. And because Jesus, after he died, appeared to us in a transformed state afterwards. And he appeared to many people afterwards. So, how do we know the tomb was empty? Well, again, by inference to the best explanation. Because the disciples could not have believed that Jesus was raised from the dead if they knew the tomb was still contained Jesus' dead body. I mean, maybe one crazy person might say that, but not a growing group of them. Not if Jesus' body was still in the tomb. And how would they know it was still in the tomb? Well, because these tombs, like the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, these tombs almost always, in fact, always contained more than one body. I mean, you go to Israel, like we've been to Israel, we've been in these tombs, you can walk in them. And so the one tomb that many people walk into, which may or may not be the tomb Jesus was interred in, you walk in like a cave in the wall, and there's like 3 or 4 benches inside this tomb where the dead bodies were placed, and the dead bodies stayed there and were attended to until their flesh decayed and rotted away, and then the bones were collected, and the bones were put in an ossuary or a bone box and placed somewhere else. This is a Jewish burials were two-stage burials. And by the way, when this explains why when Jesus at one time says to the person, when the one person says, "I'll follow you, but I've got to go bury my father first," Jesus says, "Let the dead bury the dead." Um, you know, the reason would be that to go bury your father would be a year-long process, because you put the father's dead body in a tomb until all rots away and all that's left are his bones. And then the burial really happens when the bones are put in the bone box and that box is buried. And so during the time Jesus' body was in the tomb, Joseph of Arimathea would have visited that tomb many times because there would have been other bodies in that tomb. But again, there's no way the disciples could have believed that Jesus was raised if his corpse was still lying in the tomb. And as long as the corpse of Jesus lie in the tomb, a Christian movement in Jerusalem founded on the resurrection of Jesus would never have arisen. So the empty tomb then would just be a puzzle. So N.T. Wright says this: we must insist, in fact, that whatever else had happened, if the body of Jesus of Nazareth had remained in the tomb, there would have been no early Christian belief of the sort we have discovered. And so Wright says, I regard the empty tomb as a necessary condition for the rise of the specific early Christian belief that Jesus was raised. So the empty tomb presents itself as a best explanation for this behavior of all this growing group of disciples, that the tomb must have been empty. But that would not be enough in and of itself. But you add the appearances to it, which is what N.T. Wright does, and I'm going to do now. Now we have a case for the resurrection, the historical resurrection. So I'm looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, very famous passage. And in verse 3, the Apostle Paul says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." Okay, so Paul got this information, or what turns out to be a creed, like a credo, that was said in the early church community. Paul heard it probably when he was in Jerusalem years ago. In fact, this creed is old. Even the skeptic, the incredible skeptic Bart Ehrman, who's not a Christian, but a New Testament scholar, but Ehrman places this creed about 1 year. It was in action 1 year after the cross of Christ. So this creed goes back very, very close to the death of Christ. That people were saying this. And what is the creed? Here it is. You imagine yourself in an early church service, and now you're saying this. I believe that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. I believe that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then Paul adds, then to all the apostles. Last of all, Paul says he appeared to me. And so Paul is quoting a creed. And Gary Habermas says the majority of New Testament scholars believe that Paul received this creed. He says, I pass on what I received, that Paul received this creed about 35 AD. And so we have this evidence of all these appearances, and appearing to the disciples. Did they really happen? Well, here's where you would bring in someone like the British New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Because this creed being recited over and over and over, and now being codified in the letter of Paul, this creed, as it was being shared, the eyewitnesses were still alive that would have seen Jesus, and or if they would have said, we never saw him, surely someone would have protested that these things really didn't happen. It would be like if I invented a story about myself walking on the river, on top of the river without going in, walking on top of the water, and published it about a year from now. And if I said I walked all the way from the river, which runs on my property, all the way through downtown Monroe, right out to Lake Erie, and I did it during the day, and I did it during the time of the Jazz Festival when there's 10,000 people on the river down near downtown. And I said, and many people saw me walking on the river. I mean, if I published that a year from now, there would be hundreds and hundreds of people who would say that we didn't see anybody walking. So the power of the eyewitness accounts, and as presented in Baucham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, attests to the truth of this story. So we have an empty tomb, a belief in the empty tomb, and we have a belief in these appearances. A belief so strong you would give your life for the sake of this. No, man, he is raised from the dead. I'm not going to change my mind. And so that explanation sufficiently explains the disciples' behavior in the first church. An empty tomb and the appearances of a risen Jesus, that would be a great explanation for the emergence of the belief that Jesus was risen. So using inference to the best explanation, it makes sense. What explains the early behavior of these Christians? Going out and saying he is risen, Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. He is not here. And other people saying it and then suffering and giving their lives for it. What best explains that? Well, a sufficient explanation would be they all believed the tomb was empty and that Jesus had appeared to them. And that they kept meeting him for a period of time when he was resurrected. If you had those beliefs, what would come out of it would be the message, he is risen. He has been raised from the dead. So N.T. Wright says, we are left with the conclusion that the combination of an empty tomb and appearances of the risen Jesus, a living Jesus, forms a set of circumstances which is both necessary and sufficient for the rise of the early Christian belief. How did they come to believe that he was risen? Well, an empty tomb and appearances would sufficiently explain why they believed he was risen. Okay. What other explanations would there be? This is where it gets very interesting. And people like Gary Habermas, in his book on the resurrection, and so on, catalog alternative explanations. Let me go back to the ink blot thing as an analogy. You walk into a room, it's a tile floor. On the floor is fresh black ink forming a perfect portrait of Abraham Lincoln. What's the best explanation for that? Well, I think it would be that an artist took some ink and painted that on the floor. But let's say a skeptic says, yeah, but it could have happened randomly. Someone could have just dropped the black ink, would have formed the portrait of Abraham Lincoln. Well, it could. Its probability is extremely low. But it could. But that's not the best explanation. And so some people give other explanations for the event of the faith of the early church, and these Christians giving their lives for the message that their faith was placed in. And one of them was that these stories were invented post-crucifixion by a movement that was inventing and writing these stories to try to bolster their movement. But the question would be, okay, but why would all these people, many of them, become martyred? Why would they suffer and be martyred for the sake of a message that they knew they just made up? How would you explain that? Maybe one, person with mental issues might do that, but surely not groups of people, and persistently over the years. N.T. Wright says no explanation, no other explanation that historians have been able to come up with has the power to explain the phenomena that's before us, namely the rise in faith in the early church. And it seems exaggerated and fantastic to think that early Christians invented the empty tomb or the sightings of the risen Jesus. Rather, they developed faith because something happened to them. And no one was expecting that kind of thing. And no kind of conversion experience would have generated these ideas. Nobody would have invented that. And to suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and enter into another fantasy world. And so N.T. Wright says, in terms of the kind of proof which historians normally accept, the case we have presented, that the tomb plus the appearances combination, that's what generated early Christian belief. Wright says that's as watertight as you are as likely to find. That's the best explanation for the faith of the early church. In addition to this, N.T. Wright and Bill Craig add some other things. We know it's a historical fact that after Jesus was crucified and after they were saying he's risen from the dead, the early Christians began to meet on Sunday as their special day of gathering. So that happened. And what's the best explanation for that? Because that was the day they believed that Christ had been raised from the dead. And then another reason that you add to this inference to the best explanation is that after the crucifixion and after the burial in the tomb, there is no evidence of anyone going to the tomb of Jesus and worshiping there and making an icon out of it and venerating it. And then another reason would be there never was a question of anyone performing the second stage of the two-stage burial for Jesus. Stage one, the body is placed on a shelf in a cave, a tomb, with maybe 3-4 other shelves in it. The body decays, the flesh rots away, all that's left are the bones. This is a year and a half later. The bones are collected, put in an ossuary and a bone box, and buried. But there's no evidence anywhere of any second stage burial of Jesus. And another point would be this: if someone like the disciples wanted to invent a story about Jesus, the likelihood that they would have had the women be the ones discover the empty tomb, and the women the ones going to tell the disciples, and the women the ones who believed, and the disciples, the males, being skeptical. You wouldn't write a story like that if you wanted to impress people in the first century, because as Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian Josephus and others said, sadly, that women were not to be trusted and their testimony should not be allowed in a court of law. So the testimony of women was not highly regarded. And so if you wrote a legend about this, if you invented it, you would not write women into the story to do this, which argues for the truth of this story. And actually, it's called, in historical study, it's called the criterion of embarrassment. That is, if there's an embarrassing fact that embarrasses the one who writes it, but who writes it in any way, it probably happened. It probably happened that way. And then there's one more thing that N.T. Wright points out. He said, you don't want to make too much of this, but it's interesting because there was an inscription found near Nazareth from the reign of Claudius that is very close to the crucifixion and the tomb, and it says this. It says this ancient archaeological discovery: an ordinance of Caesar It is my pleasure that graves and tombs remain undisturbed in perpetuity, that is forever. If any man has information that some other person has demolished them or in any way extracted the buried body or has maliciously transferred bodies to other places or has displaced the seal or the stones, then they should be brought in and they are subject to capital punishment. Now, N.T. Wright says, there is a likelihood that that inscription was put up after Jesus died and was buried, because the story was that Jesus was buried in that tomb and the tomb was empty. Look, for all these reasons, I conclude that a historian has no option, because the best explanation of is that the tomb was empty and those appearances of Jesus were historical events. And we can't account for Christianity without those things. So that's an intro to the case for the historical resurrection. And I'm going to be looking now for some comments. I'm also posting on my blog later tonight some resources, some video links to Gary Habermas, who arguably is the greatest scholar we have on this, to Habermas's website, but a video, an hour-and-a-half video of him arguing for the resurrection. I've got an hour-and-a-half video of N.T. Wright arguing for the historical resurrection that you'll be able to link to. I've got the link to N.T. Wright's book. Again, this book is $2.99 for Kindle. It's 800 pages of immense scholarship, if you really wanted to get into it. And then I've got a video link to my friend William Lane Craig making his famous argument for the historical resurrection. So Jesse says, I recommend Lee Strobel's A Case for Christ. Yeah, yes. I mean, the resurrection ideas are put in Strobel's book as he interviews those great New Testament scholars. So, hey Neil, and I'm saying hello to folks. Hi Terry. I'm wondering now, does anyone have some questions? Rhonda Mashad, how are you doing? Sherry Eby, it's good to see you. Donna Colleen. So anybody have a question now about what I've presented as a case for the historical resurrection of Jesus? Hi Darla from South Dakota. Okay. Any questions that anyone might have? I don't see any yet. Okay, I'm going to maybe invent a few questions. Not really. I'm just going to hang out a little bit here and see if anyone has a thought or a comment. You have a thought, a comment? Did it make sense to you? I've got some links I'm going to post when I get done here that you can follow up on if you want to. Maybe the book to read I've got is Gary Habermas's book, along with Michael Licona, two great biblical scholars. Their book still remains one of the best books, and you'll see the link to that on my blog post. Okay. I'm looking. Thank you for the thumbs up. I'm looking for some questions. Someone who out there who loves me, ask a question, okay? Because then I'll feel a little bit better. And I hope I'm not missing anything here. Let me look. Let me try this other thing here. Okay, hang on. Okay, oh, Matt wants to know your thoughts on the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin. Gary Habermas writes about the Shroud of Turin, and I think if you go to Habermas's website and you look and you go to one of those links, he writes about that. My thoughts are I don't pay any attention to it, but there are some very good scholars. I'm thinking even J.P. Moreland might be one of them. Habermas might think the Shroud of Turin is from the 1st century. It's been quite a debate. Personally, it's not something. I mean, it's interesting. It's not something that I've spent a lot of time on, but I do know that there are some good scholars who are skeptics that it was a later. It was something that was made later, and there are some good scholars who think you can date it from the 1st century. Thank you for that question. Any other thoughts or questions? How are we doing out there? I'm just going to start saying hello to folks. Hi, Justine. Neil Lindblade, are you still there? Thanks for joining. Terry in South Dakota. Hi, Renee. Thank you for your affirmation about sharing the thoughts and the addition.